What if the greatest military mind America ever produced was destroyed not by an enemy bullet, but by the ambitions of men who feared what he knew, and what he might do with that knowledge? In the winter of 1945, as the guns of the Second World War fell silent across the ruins of a broken Europe, a silence of a very different kind settled over the American command. It was not the silence of peace. It was the silence of reckoning, the kind that comes when powerful men realize that the war they won has already given birth to the next one, and that the soldier best equipped to fight it is the one they are most desperate to silence. General George Smith Patton, Jr., the man who had driven his Third Army further, faster, and with more devastating precision than any commander in the Western theater, was beginning to say things that made Washington very uncomfortable. He was saying them loudly. He was saying them often. And he showed absolutely no intention of stopping. The story of what happened next, and the night Dwight David Eisenhower finally understood that a young senator from Massachusetts named John Fitzgerald Kennedy would never lend his voice to defend Patton's vision, is one of the most consequential and least told stories in modern American history. It is a story about loyalty, politics, ambition, and the brutal arithmetic of power. And it begins, as so many great American tragedies do, on the edge of triumph. If this kind of hidden history is what you've been looking for, right now is the moment to subscribe to this channel, hit that like button, share this video with someone who loves real history, and drop a comment below telling us what you already know about Patton, because what comes next will challenge everything you think you do. By the summer of 1945, George Patton was the most famous general in the world. His face had been on the cover of Time magazine. His name was spoken in the same breath as Napoleon and Julius Caesar. Children in France and Luxembourg left flowers outside buildings where he had slept. In the villages of Bavaria, men whispered that he was not entirely human, that something ancient and relentless moved inside him. He had commanded the 7th Army in Sicily in 1943, orchestrating a campaign so swift that it left Field Marshal Harold Alexander speechless. He had broken through at Avranches in August of 1944, turning the entire German line in Normandy and effectively sealing the fate of Hitler's forces in France. He had relieved the besieged garrison at Bastogne in December of 1944, arriving in the depths of winter with a speed that his own officers called impossible. But by the spring of 1945, as the war in Europe officially ended on May 8th, Victory in Europe Day, Patton was already looking east. Not at the ruins of Germany, at the Soviet Union. And the things he was saying about the Soviets, in private mess halls and occasionally in front of journalists, were beginning to reach the desks of men who could end careers with a single phone call to Washington. Patton's contempt for Soviet power was not abstract. It was visceral, strategic, and rooted in direct observation. In the months following Germany's surrender, he was appointed military governor of Bavaria, a role that placed him in direct contact with the human wreckage of the Nazi regime and the creeping shadow of Soviet occupation expanding from the east. He watched Red Army troops move into Poland, into Czechoslovakia, into Hungary, and he saw not liberators but conquerors wearing a different uniform. On August 11, 1945, at a press conference in Bad Tölz, Bavaria, Patton made remarks that sent shockwaves through the American military and political establishment. He compared the Nazi Party to American political parties, suggesting, with characteristic bluntness, that most Germans who had held positions under Hitler had done so out of pragmatic necessity rather than ideological conviction, much like Americans who joined the Democratic or Republican parties for career advancement. The remark was tactless, poorly worded, and politically catastrophic. But behind it lay something more dangerous than poor judgment. Behind it lay a coherent, deeply held strategic vision that Patton had been quietly developing for months. A vision that called for the immediate rearming of German forces and a military push against the Soviet Union before Stalin could consolidate his grip on Eastern Europe. Dwight David Eisenhower had known George Patton for decades. They had served together, argued together, and forged the kind of complex professional bond that only war can create between two men of equal brilliance and incompatible temperament. Eisenhower was methodical, political, patient, a man who understood that victory in war required not just the movement of armies but the management of alliances, egos, and public opinion. Patton was fire. Patton was velocity. Patton was the kind of man who won battles by making everyone around him, friend and enemy alike, slightly afraid of what he might do next. Eisenhower had covered for Patton before, most famously after the slapping incidents in Sicily in August of 1943, when Patton struck two hospitalized soldiers he accused of cowardice, very nearly ending his career and forcing Eisenhower into one of the most difficult decisions of the war. He had defended Patton because he needed him. But by September of 1945, the calculus had changed. The war was over. The political architecture of the post-war world was being assembled at Potsdam and in the corridors of the State Department. And Patton's increasingly vocal hostility toward the Soviet Union, an ally, however uncomfortable, was becoming a liability that no amount of battlefield brilliance could offset. On September 28, 1945, Eisenhower officially relieved George Patton of command of the Third Army. The decision was announced with careful diplomatic language. Patton was transferred to command the 15th Army, a largely administrative force tasked with compiling the official history of the war in Europe. It was, in effect, a removal from power. A silencing. Patton understood it perfectly. He wrote in his diary that he had been sent to command a paper army, and that his career as a fighting soldier was finished. What the official record does not fully capture is the private agony of that moment, the conversations that took place in those final weeks between Eisenhower and his staff, the calls placed to Washington, the growing awareness that the political environment in the United States had shifted in ways that made a man like Patton not just inconvenient but actively dangerous to the emerging post-war consensus. The Democratic administration of Harry S. Truman, who had assumed the presidency on April 12, 1945, following the death of Franklin Roosevelt, was committed to a policy of cautious engagement with the Soviet Union. Patton's calls for confrontation were not just militarily provocative, they were politically toxic. And the men in Washington who might have defended him were, one by one, choosing not to. It is here that a younger figure enters the story, not yet as a president, not yet even as a senator, but as a voice in the broader American political conversation that Eisenhower was carefully reading. John Fitzgerald Kennedy was, in the autumn of 1945, a 28-year-old veteran and aspiring politician from Boston, Massachusetts. He had served as a Navy lieutenant, had commanded PT-109 in the Pacific, had survived its sinking in August of 1943 in the Solomon Islands, and had returned to civilian life with a combination of genuine heroism, fragile health, and the enormous political machinery of his father, Joseph P. Kennedy Sr., working quietly behind him. Joseph Kennedy was one of the most well-connected and strategically calculating figures in American public life. A former ambassador to the court of St. James's, a man who had met with British and European leaders throughout the 1930s, and a man whose isolationist views before Pearl Harbor had made him politically radioactive, but personally influential in ways that money could sustain long after the microphones were turned off. The Kennedy family's relationship to the military establishment was complicated by history, and John Kennedy's emerging political identity would be shaped in ways that Patton supporters would find deeply frustrating. To understand why Eisenhower came to the realization that Kennedy would never back Patton, it is necessary to understand what backing Patton actually meant in the autumn and winter of 1945. It meant endorsing the idea that the United States should treat the Soviet Union as the next enemy, not the last ally. It meant accepting Patton's argument that the West had made a catastrophic error by stopping at the Elbe River in April of 1945, an argument Patton had made loudly and repeatedly, insisting that American and British forces should have driven all the way to Berlin, and beyond if necessary, before allowing Soviet power to fill the vacuum of defeated Germany. It meant challenging the entire framework of Allied cooperation that had been painstakingly constructed by Roosevelt at Tehran in November of 1943 and at Yalta in February of 1945. And it meant staking one's political future on a confrontational foreign policy that, in 1945 and 1946, remained deeply unpopular with an American public exhausted by 4 years of total war. John Kennedy, who was beginning to position himself for a run at the Massachusetts congressional seat in 1946, was not going to attach his name to that position. His instincts, and his father's advice, pointed in a different direction entirely. The political geography of post-war America was shifting faster than most observers could track. In November of 1945, Patton gave an interview to journalists in which he spoke with disturbing candor about the Soviet threat, the inadequacy of denazification policies in Germany, and his own belief that the American military was being systematically dismantled at precisely the moment when strength was most essential. The interview was explosive. It attracted editorial condemnation from newspapers across the country. In the Senate, voices rose in outrage. In the White House, Truman was furious. Eisenhower, who had by now returned to Washington to serve as Army Chief of Staff, a role he officially assumed on November 19, 1945, was placed in the impossible position of defending or condemning a man he had known for 30 years. He chose, with visible reluctance, the path of institutional discipline. Patton was not court-martialed. He was not publicly destroyed. But he was made to understand, through the accumulated weight of institutional pressure, that his time as a commanding voice in American strategic affairs was over. The question of whether any significant political figure would rise to his defense was being answered, in the most eloquent way possible, through silence. John Kennedy did not write about Patton in his letters or published writings of this period. He did not include Patton's strategic vision in his early political speeches. When Kennedy launched his successful campaign for the 11th Congressional District of Massachusetts in 1946, his message centered on veterans' issues, housing, healthcare, and the pragmatic concerns of working-class Boston, not on the geopolitical confrontationalism that Patton had championed. This was not cowardice. Kennedy was, in fact, deeply intellectually engaged with questions of foreign policy. His 1940 book, Why England Slept, based on his Harvard thesis, had demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of the costs of strategic unpreparedness. But Kennedy's framework for understanding those costs was fundamentally different from Patton's. Kennedy believed in institutional strength, in preparation, in the careful calibration of power, not in the preemptive, aggressive posture that Patton was advocating. And in the winter of 1945, as Patton's career collapsed around him, that distinction mattered enormously to the men in Washington who were watching both of them. On December 9, 1945, George Patton was involved in a serious automobile accident near Mannheim, Germany. His staff car collided with a military truck on a road outside the city. Patton was thrown forward and struck the partition behind the driver's seat. He suffered a broken neck, a fracture of the third and fourth cervical vertebrae. He was paralyzed from the neck down but remained conscious and mentally alert. He was transported to the 130th Station Hospital in Heidelberg, where a team of specialists, including neurosurgeon Colonel Donald Sperling, worked to stabilize him. For 12 days, the world held its breath. Patton, characteristically, refused to acknowledge the possibility of defeat even as his body failed him. He dictated notes. He demanded reports. He spoke with visitors with something approaching his old fire. But the injury was catastrophic, and the complications that followed, pulmonary embolism and edema, proved insurmountable. On December 21, 1945, at 5:50 in the morning, George Smith Patton Jr. died in his sleep at the age of 60. He was the last great casualty of the war in Europe, a man killed not by an enemy, but by the grinding machinery of circumstance. He was buried, at his own request, with his men, at the American Military Cemetery in Ham, Luxembourg, among the soldiers of the Third Army who had followed him across the face of a continent. The news of Patton's death reached Washington on the morning of December 21. Eisenhower, who was then at his desk at the Pentagon preparing for the enormous administrative challenge of demobilizing the largest army in American history, received the report with a stillness that those present described as profound. Whatever complicated feelings he had carried about Patton in those final months, the frustration, the embarrassment, the sadness of watching a brilliant soldier become politically untenable, collapsed in that moment into something simpler and more ancient. He had lost a soldier. He had lost a friend. He had lost the man who, more than any other single individual, had made the liberation of Europe possible in the time and manner that it occurred. John Kennedy, then preparing the final stages of his congressional campaign back in Massachusetts, likely learned of Patton's death from the same newspapers that brought the news to the rest of the country. There is no recorded statement from Kennedy on Patton's death. There is no eulogy, no letter of condolence to the family, no public acknowledgement of the loss in any medium that historians have been able to locate. The silence is not an accusation, but it is a fact. And in the world of post-war American politics, facts like that carry a particular weight. If this story is opening doors in your understanding of how power really works, this is the moment to subscribe to this channel, give this video a like, share it with a friend who loves serious history, and write a comment below telling us what surprised you most, because the story is not over yet. The years that followed Patton's death revealed, with slow and painful clarity, exactly the kind of strategic environment that Patton had feared. The Soviet Union tested its first atomic bomb on August 29, 1949. China fell to Mao Zedong's communist forces on October 1, 1949. The Korean War began on June 25, 1950, drawing American forces back into combat less than 5 years after the end of the Second World War. The Cold War, which Patton had, in his blunt and undiplomatic way, been trying to prevent by confronting Soviet expansion at its earliest and most vulnerable stage, had become the defining reality of the age. Eisenhower watched these developments from positions of increasing institutional authority, eventually accepting the Republican nomination for president in 1952 and winning the general election against Adlai Stevenson in November of that year. As president, Eisenhower developed the doctrine of massive retaliation, poured resources into the nuclear arsenal, and navigated the terrifying geography of Cold War confrontation with the careful patience that had always characterized his approach to power. But those who knew him in private said that he sometimes grew quiet when Patton's name was mentioned, as though the memory arrived carrying something unresolved. Kennedy, meanwhile, rose through the political ranks with a speed and grace that surprised even his admirers. He won his congressional seat in 1946, was elected to the Senate from Massachusetts in 1952, the same year Eisenhower won the presidency, and by 1956 was being discussed seriously as a possible vice presidential candidate on the Democratic ticket. His 1956 book, Profiles in Courage, which won the Pulitzer Prize in 1957, was a meditation on the nature of political bravery, specifically, the courage required to take unpopular stands in the face of institutional pressure. The irony of a book about political courage written by a man who had never publicly defended Patton's strategic vision was not lost on everyone who read it. But history rarely offers clean symmetries, and Kennedy's definition of courage was shaped by different imperatives than Patton's. Kennedy was building a political movement. Patton had been trying to change the direction of an empire. These are different projects. They require different tools. And they are judged, ultimately, by different standards. What the night that Eisenhower realized Kennedy would never back Patton ultimately reveals is something timeless and unsettling about the nature of power in a democracy. It reveals that the men best equipped to act, the ones with the clearest vision of what is coming and the most direct experience of what it costs to be unprepared, are often the ones least able to survive the political ecosystem that determines whose voice gets amplified and whose gets buried. Patton saw the Cold War forming before it had a name. He understood, with a soldier's instinct, that the window for confronting Soviet expansion was finite and closing. He was not wrong in his assessment of the strategic challenge, even if he was spectacularly wrong in his understanding of how to navigate the political world in which that challenge had to be addressed. Eisenhower knew this, and on some quiet evening in the autumn of 1945, perhaps in his office, perhaps in the spare quarters of some requisitioned German building, he arrived at the understanding that the rising generation of American political leaders, the Kennedys and their kind, were going to build the post-war world on different foundations than the ones Patton had bled for. It was not a moment of bitterness. It was a moment of clarity. And clarity, in the lives of great men, is often the loneliest thing there is. If this story moved you, challenged you, or taught you something you didn't know before, then this is your moment. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss history told like this. Hit the like button to help this story reach more people. Share this video with someone who deserves to understand how the world they live in was actually built. And leave a comment below telling us what you found most surprising. Because the greatest histories are the ones we discover together.